It's 11, so I'm going to get us going. Thank you, everyone who is in attendance today. We are going to go through a presentation discussing getting ready for TRI reporting, just some logistics. We are going to record this webinar and post it afterwards. The mics are muted for this webinar. However, the chat is open. So if you do have any questions while I'm speaking, feel free to throw it in the chat and I will get to them at the end of the presentation. Other than that, let's kick it off. So getting ready for TRI reporting, my name is Gab Orman. I'm a registered environmental engineer and the Director of Compliance Technologies here with Toolkit. What is Toolkit? So Toolkit is a customizable active compliance management software suite and consulting shop that is designed and built to make your day-to-day EH&S compliance both active and efficient. We offer a few tools. The most relevant to today's discussion is going to be our TRI Toolkit, which is a guided end-to-end EPA, TRI reporting, and submittal tool. It uses built-in logic and IVAI to reduce time, errors, and risk that we would associate with our typical TRI reporting data. Some other tools we offer, we do have our compliance tool, which is an environmental management system, our determination tool, which helps you with those regulatory applicability determinations. We have our emissions tool, which does centralize your emissions data, help you with those calculations, and it also feeds into your TRI reporting as well, so you don't have to do double math. We have our parsing tool, which turns your permits and plans into actionable requirements. And we also do engage in traditional consulting methods as well. As for today's agenda, we're going to talk about the TRI program's workflow and some tips and tricks on what you should be preparing for now versus what you can kind of trickle in through the next few months. So that means looking at the products and activity levels, looking at our thresholds and exemptions, our release profiles, and just some high-level common issues and how to mitigate them. This is the big picture. TRI's workflow, you start by looking at your products and where those TRI chemicals are, and you go through each step. You define your activity levels, compare it against your thresholds, and then once you know what chemicals you're exceeding for, you then start looking at, well, what did I release in this past year? Ultimately, you get a bunch of data about your releases for your TRI chemicals, and then you are going to do your final review of that data, fill out the Form R, and submit it to EPA. So step one, looking at your products. Adding products to TRI Toolkit or into your TRI reporting spreadsheet really requires you to have an in-depth knowledge on what products you have, what their chemical compositions are, and which of those chemicals are going to be TRI reportable. So just straight off the bat, this takes a lot of time. You have to itemize each product. You're often digging through like a stack of SDSs and manually pulling out those chemical percentages. It can take a while. This is one of those steps where I highly recommend that you and your team start this process sooner rather than later. Often, I would recommend putting everything into an inventory system, but that will allow you to easily speciate your products into their individual chemicals to save a lot of time. Because most facilities are doing that manual data entry and manual speciation, there's a lot of room for error in this step, and making sure that you take your time and go through your process and go through your products can save you a lot of grief down the line. Once you know what your products are and what TRI chemicals you have, your next step is going to define your activity levels. What I mean by activity level is really how much did you use that product? How much of that did you manufacture? How much did you process? How much did you otherwise use? Are you generating any byproducts or co-products from your process? Are you generating any unique waste streams that may contain a TRI chemical? And so understanding the what comes from products, understanding the how much and the quantity comes from defining your activity levels. Ultimately, what this gets down to is what percentage of all of this activity involved a TRI chemical. So what this looks like is that you're going to say, okay, how much diesel fuel did my facility consume? And what percentage of that is a TRI chemical? And so at the end, you get a small percentage of lead, a small percentage of other chemicals that are in your fuels and in your products. Maybe you have some hydrochloric acid. Either way, you're spending a lot of time collecting your products and collecting that operational information. I used to be an EHS manager and I spent a lot of time running around the floor chasing after the products owners and the production team just to get that data. And so start this process sooner rather than later. If you're doing all of this in a spreadsheet, it can take a while to organize it and fill it out properly. TRI Toolkit, the main perk here is that you're going to have the option to do SDS parsing, and you can just simply answer, I used this amount of diesel fuel, I used this amount of this product, and it does all the math for you. We're going to go ahead and show you what that looks like real quick, at least for the SDS parsing. This is TRI Toolkit. You'll come over to the products section. Down here, you can see that there is a list of all of the existing chemicals, and you can see what their breakdowns are. Up here, you can either manually add new products, do an SDS upload, or do a bulk import of Excel data. So just to show you what this SDS parser looks like, you choose your file. I'm going to choose just a simple hydrochloric acid. You upload it, it takes a few seconds. You can upload 50 at a time. See how quickly this just pulled up? And it gets the product name. You can change what your usage units are, and then it breaks it down into its components. So here we have water. It lets us know that that is not a TRI chemical. Hydrochloric acid, which is a TRI chemical, and we have it in this range of 35 to 38%. You need to click here to review your SDS just to make sure that the system pulled it properly. And we can see that it did, 35 to 38%. And it's really just that simple. And so that'll save you a lot of time, rather than manually pulling each of that info and digging through the SDS. Once you've done your activity levels, you should have a general idea of what TRI chemicals you are interacting with the most. So often facilities will have 1, 2, maybe up to 5 or 10 TRI chemicals that are kind of standing out as being potential for threshold exceedances. Once I know what my product list looks like, that's when I like to re-review my exemptions. TRI does offer quite a few exemptions to the reporting process. The one I see that is most commonly used is our percent de minimis exemption. This allows you to exclude any toxic chemicals that are less than 1% in concentration, or any carcinogenic chemicals that are less than 0.1%. So if you're familiar with SDS rules, this does follow that pretty closely. However, one big caveat to that is that the de minimis exemption does not apply to PBTs. I'll see people get tripped up on that and not report as many PBTs as they should be because they assume that they can use the de minimis exemption, and that's simply not true. For the article exemption, this is another one that can give you a lot of support, especially if you're a manufacturer that is building a certain type of end product. Articles are manufactured items that are formed to a specific shape or design during production. The shape or design of that item does determine its function. And however you are using that article, it is not causing the toxic chemical to be released as part of that normal condition. These are going to look like metal fasteners, copper-coated wires, any steel rods, where really what you're doing is you're cutting copper wire off of a spool and then you're installing it into your product. You're not generating a lot of dust or other potential issues. You're just utilizing an article. The article exemption can be a little tricky. In general, it applies if the shape is kept, there's not a release, or it's a release under 0.5 pounds per year. If you're wondering if you can use the article exemption, some good rules of thumb is that you're going to lose the article exemption if you're generating a lot of dust, if you're melting it or extruding it in any sort of way, or if pieces of that article are ultimately being discarded, you will likely lose the article exemption for that particular article. Two more exemptions that I find pretty useful. The first is that you can exempt a portion of your chemicals that are used for a specific purpose. This is largely pointed at structural components of your facility. So if you build out something and you use steel beams, you don't need to include that steel beam in your TRI calculations. It excludes routine janitorial and routine facility maintenance activities. It excludes motor vehicle maintenance, and if there's any contamination present in your process water or process air intakes, you don't need to account for that. You just need to account for whatever you are adding to that process water or air at the end. One big warning for the specific uses is that TRI does put very clear boundaries on the specific use exemption. And so if you've used it in the past or you want to use it, think it might be applicable, just be very aware of what those boundaries are and make sure that your use of that chemical fits in before you exclude it from your calculations. And the last exemption I want to touch on is our laboratory exemption. So TRI chemicals that are strictly used in a laboratory setting can be excluded. This is intended to exclude research and analytical activities. It's not intended to exclude just technical grade chemicals. So I've often seen people try to claim a laboratory exemption because they're using laboratory grade chemicals, and that's not the case. It's specifically, I am using this to run an analytical test in a laboratory. Something that's very helpful by using a system like TRI Toolkit is that it does give you direct access to EPA help articles and EPA Q&As, as well as expert advice on claiming these exemptions. It's very often that facilities might be able to utilize exemptions a bit more than they do. So you have your activity levels, you have your chemicals, you've looked at your exemptions, and now it's time to review your processing amounts against the TRI thresholds. What you're going to do is you'll sum up each chemical's usage for each category, so manufacturing, processing, and otherwise using, and then you will compare that total against the TRI threshold. If you're exceeding for a chemical, that's the chemical you need to report on. For manufacturing, the general threshold is 25,000 pounds. The same is true for processing at 25,000 pounds, and otherwise use is 10,000 pounds. Beware that some chemicals have a lower threshold. So if it's a chemical that's known to be highly toxic or is of particular concern, it can have a lower threshold under TRI. Some common ones right now, it's going to be lead, PFAS, PCBs, dioxins, and mercury are pretty common chemicals you see at your facilities. I've just seen this trip someone up. They assume they get the 25,000 and the 10,000 pounds in their head, and they just assume that's for everything. And that's not the case. There is a list online, or if you're using TRI Toolkit, it's directly connected to that list that will make sure that you don't trip up and miss that threshold. So just be aware that if you have highly toxic chemicals, probably has a lower threshold. TRI Toolkit, Like I said, it's directly connected to EPA's list of TRI chemicals, so it's easy to spot what your exceedances are. If you're using a spreadsheet, it can just be a little more difficult to identify exceedances as quickly. Probably have some complicated conditional formatting that can get in the way of actual functionality. We've all been there. TRI Toolkit does that review for you and does give you some visualization of your thresholds. So it's really just a graph that looks like this. So once you've put in your activity levels and products, you can easily see that you are exceeding a threshold. For this facility, we are exceeding for mercury and lead and tetrabromobisphenol. So we'll need to report on those three chemicals. It summarizes your exemptions, and you can come down here and see what products you're using that are contributing to that exceedance as well. So it just makes it a little easier to get some meaningful information from your data. Once you have the chemicals you're exceeding for, now you can focus in and actually think about your release profiles and calculate how much you released of that chemical. So just because you used over 10,000 pounds of styrene doesn't mean that you necessarily emitted 10,000 pounds of styrene. And so it's important to then say, okay, what are my actual release points for this TRI chemical? I've broken it down into air, waste, and water, air, water, waste, which is how you will also report it on your TRI form. This is where the meat and potatoes is. This is a lot of math. It's a lot of tracking down your processes. So just be aware that this is going to take you a while and you're going to question your sanity just a little bit while you are putting this together, especially if you're using an Excel sheet. To start with, the release profiles for fugitive and stack air emissions. You want to really identify any process that could emit your chemicals. It can be an intentional or an unintentional release. So you're not just looking at those endpoints, you're looking at every step of your process that's using that TRI chemical. Common ones that I see missed are dust from the transfers of product. So if I'm taking product from a tank or a pit and I'm bringing it to another area, if it is a particulate product, it's going to emit dust when you move it, and that is a release of whatever chemicals are in there. Similarly, any volatile organic losses from tanks or from just general product usage. So if you have solvents on site or you have paint on site, this is a really common emission and release for the TRI program. Speaking of paint overspray, we often think of it for particulate matter emissions, but many pigments do contain heavy metals in them. Most heavy metals are part of the TRI program, and so making sure that you are accounting for any paint overspray or any general paint emissions that are at your facility. For air, you're going to need emission factors, you're going to need any stack testing data you may have, or any other supported ways to calculate your emissions. Thankfully, this part of TRI does have a pretty significant overlap with air emission inventory data. So if you are a facility that does have air emission tracking, you already have a lot of this data available for yourself. Just make sure that you are accounting for those little tiny emissions that maybe aren't in your air permit. When it comes to water, there are three categories, and it's releases to water bodies, releases to injection wells, or POTW transfers. When we think about releases to water bodies, I think it's easy to assume it's just talking about spills, but TRI program is specifically talking about like stormwater runoff and spills if you had them released to water bodies. But the most common one I see is calculating stormwater runoff. So if there are any areas at your facility where stormwater can contact your processing areas, you need to account for that in your release profile. Hopefully you might have some total suspended solids data, or maybe you can estimate this off of solubility information for those chemicals. But either way, you do need to estimate that stormwater runoff and what percentage or component is a TRI chemical. Very common if you have outside dumpsters that aren't covered. For injection wells, you're looking at any disposal to dry wells or injection wells on site. This is a less common one, but if you do have dry wells and you had a spill to a dry well, that's something you would want to address here. And POTW transfers, if you have like a pre-treatment industrial permit and it goes to the sewer system and to your local POTW, that is going to be based off of your monitoring program for that. And so you'll just want to take your data and make sure that you are addressing that release information. For land and offsite transfers, we're looking at surface impoundments. If you have like evaporation ponds on site, we have spills. So the big one, if you've spilled anything to land, you do need to account for that in your release profiles, and any general infiltration of potentially contaminated water. I've grouped together the offsite transfer with land because often we're talking about transferring offsite to a landfill or other land disposal type. So any hazardous waste you've transferred offsite, any solid waste that maybe has a TRI chemical present, that needs to be accounted for. And so you'll want to largely estimate this with production volumes, any manifest or shipping papers you have, and any records showcasing what percentage of the waste did contain your TRI chemical. The last three are the release profiles associated with energy recovery, recycling, and treatment. This is if you're doing this on site. If you are doing these activities on site, I caution you to double check your data when you're doing these release profiles, because I see time and time again, people double count these activities in your threshold determination. So say that I have a waste containing styrene and then I'm recycling that on site to recover the styrene. It's very common to accidentally double count that activity. And you just want to make sure that you're tracking the same styrene through the whole process without adding extra to it all. You want to really capture any on-site activity that leads to the usage or recovery of a toxic chemical so that you can do that big mass balance and figure out what your ultimate totals are. In a spreadsheet, when you're doing your release calculations, you have to double check your release profiles every year. I don't know how many of you are used to digging into your Excel sheets, but when you have to click in and you have this really complicated long formula in a single cell, and then you're tracking all of your data back to little tiny cells on other sheets or on other tabs, it can be difficult to identify where any of your errors are. So don't leave this until like June 30th is what I'm getting at. You want to start this process early. If you use something like TRI Toolkit, TRI Toolkit does copy your release profiles over from year to year, and it allows you to separate out the data from the equations. So it allows you to easily see where a calculation error is occurring or where something might not make sense. It also makes it a bit easier, well, significantly easier to add in new processes. So in an Excel sheet, it can get kind of hard if you have to add in a column or add in a new process. This is what TRI Toolkit's release profiles look like. So you have air, water, land, and on-site activities, and you can just click through and add in your release profiles. If you do choose to work with TRI Toolkit, we do all of the release profile building for you. So we help identify any errors you might have in your spreadsheets. We get the release profiles in there, and we help you get going and get your TRI data accurate and into the system without any hiccups. If you're doing a traditional spreadsheet method, you are answering questions the entire time and probably going back and answering questions that you thought you had all the answers to, and going back and forth and hoping that you got all the info you need. It takes a while. You start feeling like you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, but it gets there. And as long as you can get those answers sooner rather than later, you should be good to go. You want to double check and triple check your data to make sure that all of your product usage is accurate, make sure all your calculations are accurate. This program is very comprehensive and it's very easy to add an extra zero or skip a step in this process. So set aside time for data validation and QA/QC. From there, you're going to fill out your form, Rs, and file those with EPA and CDX. One of the perks of something like TRI Toolkit is that it's going to fill out this form for you. So there's a lot less second guessing and a lot less paperwork on your end when it comes to TRI. Now, to close on just some common TRI mistakes, and hopefully you guys get to avoid them this season and look like pros. First one I see is kind of a legacy stagnant Excel spreadsheet. So these TRI spreadsheets, it's comprehensive and they're massive. Maybe you have 30 tabs in them. You only update it once a year during TRI reporting season. And so it is difficult to update these spreadsheets without breaking them, especially if you're not opening them relatively frequently. You're constantly checking your release profiles. And in my experience, they kind of turn into a black box where your team knows I put in data here, it pops out numbers at the end, and I'm just going to trust that they're accurate, which isn't always the case and often leads to errors in your release reporting. Whoever made the sheet's typically the only one that has a shot at using and updating it with any sort of accuracy, so it's easier to lose knowledge over time. If you are using an Excel spreadsheet, I just recommend writing really intensive instructions and going slowly and carefully. Obviously, the easy answer would be to switch over to a TRI reporting software, but spreadsheets, make sure you're updating them frequently. Second one, which I emphasized this a bit earlier, is improper exemption usage. If you're releasing more than 0.5 pounds per year from an article and you're not reporting it, that's going to be a problem. If you're failing to include reportable components in a product, that's of concern. And if you're claiming one of those special use exemptions without meeting all of the conditions, that's a problem. And so that's going to cause you to underreport your releases to EPA, and it's not a good look to not complete your reporting in an accurate manner. Missing information. TRI is incredibly comprehensive, and that can lead to really easy mistakes in information gathering. It's easy to miss a product on your list that has a TRI chemical that you weren't aware of. You may miss a release profile that should have been included, which is very common for those fugitive air emissions or any stormwater exposure you might have, because ultimately you don't know what you don't know. And so start early and start fresh. TRI is time consuming, so EPA estimates about 35 hours for that first chemical you must report on, and then it's about half that for any additional chemicals. Time is money, and reporting season can get really hectic, so make sure that you start early and start smart and fresh and just get it going. Thank you for coming to our webinar today. I hope you guys learned something from it. We do have a few more upcoming webinars, so in 2 weeks, we'll be doing a deeper dive into the common problems and how to solve them. And in March, we're going to look at using TRI Toolkit and TRI data to inform sustainable decision making. All webinars are going to be recorded and posted, but obviously I'd love to have you here live and asking questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, if you think of questions later, please take a picture or a screenshot of my contact information, and I'm always happy to answer when I can. Thank you, everyone. And I will stick around for the next few minutes to answer any questions you might have in the chat. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day.